Picture a blank wall. A blank canvas, really. Who decides what gets placed on the wall? It matters not whether the wall holds a captive audience, think Plato's allegory of the cave, or a voluntary one, think paying moviegoers. The prisoners in Plato's allegory are chained and are thus afforded no change of scenery. Though moviegoers are at liberty to leave, they still find themselves staring at a blank wall, in this case, a silver screen. They rely on shadow makers to populate the wall with their ideas. To that end, whether using film or finger, shadow makers project representations of the world as they have seen it. But a projection is only as strong as a cave is dark. When defining the subject and language of poetry, William Wordsworth, with the self-assured audacity of Babe Ruth pointing to the bleachers before a home run swing, claims to have invented a class of poetry that has been well adapted to interest mankind permanently. But this class of poetry is only well adapted to interest mankind because it is adapted to nature first. The Romantics are no different from the first caveman to paint on a wall, their work only necessary because there are elements of nature that cannot be brought inside the cave. When a poet places an image in a reader's mind, the reader does not literally see this image. Most immediately, a reader sees words on a page. These words, which have been assigned meaning by the conventions of language, are symbols in and of themselves. What hidden changes do images undergo when translated to the page? While it would be disingenuous to write poetry off as a dishonest attempt at art, or at the very least an imprecise attempt, a poem involves far more translation than does a painting. Image gets converted to word and then back into image once again. Poetic interpretation, if it can be put this way, is as true to a subject as a landlocked seafood restaurant is true to the food it serves. The further the distance traveled, the more chance it has to spoil before being consumed. In John Keats's To Autumn, the poet describes mossed cottage trees bent with apples. But it's not as if Keats has plucked his poem from nature and plattered it for his reader. He can only bring a representation of nature to the cave. In this way, it doesn't matter however sweet the kernel, swollen the gourd, plump the hazel shell, or ripe the fruits of autumn. His poem is an inadequate substitute for seeing and experiencing nature for oneself. And so, poetry, no matter the quality of its imagery, is no substitute for visualization. At best, poetry is a translation, an estimation of what nature might sound and read like. Because of this, Constable's paintings share greater intimacy with nature than any poem ever could. Turning to the page, Shelley's Mont Blanc contrasts the dead and living world through placing words like dead and living in close proximity. Turning to the canvas, Constable's Salisbury Cathedral contrasts man-made structures and nature in ways that play with Burke's beautiful, sublime distinction. Though the Salisbury Cathedral was the highest cathedral in England, it's not the tallest object in Constable's painting. Constable, instead, foregrounds evocative, dark trees, placing nature in between his audience and the cathedral, their shadows swallowing even more real estate. Whatever comforts, judgments, or structures religion provides, it's at the mercy of nature. While walls are literal barriers, separating the inside from the outside, windows serve to connect the two worlds. But by replacing windows with stained glass, the architects of the Salisbury Cathedral replaced natural light with man-made projection. There is a difference between self-awareness and self-indulgence. As Constable does with the Salisbury Cathedral, Wordsworth too finds fault in the highly structured constructions of his predecessors. These man-made structures, poems and buildings alike, neglect their surroundings, opting only to offer a view to the world they have constructed. This leads Wordsworth to question whether the generation before him was truly enlightened, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the shadow-making hermit sits alone. Nature is to self-indulgence as a landscape is to a blind man's eye. And so the Romantics sought to become, as one Romantic puts it, a transparent eyeball, a windowed corrective to the Salisbury's stained glass. Paradoxically, Wordsworth simultaneously places his poetry in right relation with nature while still overestimating his work. Wishing to separate from lesser writing styles, the poet initially denounced the guides and manuals of romantic tourists. But a decade later, in financial straits, Wordsworth wrote the first version of an address to these same mopping sons of idleness, as he called them in the next lines of the Brothers, now dignified as persons of taste and feeling for landscape. Wordsworth, too, is guilty of a self-indulgent hubris. He still stacks his words that they might tower over others, like the Salisbury Cathedral, his transcendent class of poetry sitting atop a wobbly Jenga tower of hypocrisy. Is his poetry deferring to nature, or is it set to interest mankind permanently? Surely, both cannot exist. Once working together, Wordsworth's ideas now contend in a crashing echo of the Tower of Babel. We were never meant to be chained to Plato's cave, illuminated only by art. To follow the metaphor to its end, shadow makers do not cast light, but darkness. So any poet who aspires to pen a class of poetry that has been well adapted to interest mankind permanently actually longs to imprison his subject. The same goes for the romantic painter as well. But if instead one teaches their audience to gain a feeling for landscape, he might prepare them to leave the cave altogether, to shift their eyes from the artificiality of the Salisbury Cathedral and to speak to autumn directly. To be clear, I find no flaw in Wordsworth's art, only in his understanding of his art. For nothing in the cave could ever truly replace nature. If a poet or painter's end goal is to join the imprisoned in the cave, they strive to no end, fated to blind themselves with the very shadows they cast. If instead, a poet or painter asks the cave dweller to join them in nature, they bring sight to the blind, light to the darkness.